Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. The missing time. Have you ever experienced a moment when reality seems to slip through your fingers like sand, leaving behind only fragments of incomprehensible memories? I, Stephen Morgan, found myself trapped in such a nightmarish scenario that would challenge everything I believed about perception and consciousness. It was a crisp autumn morning in Massachusetts when I first realized something was terribly wrong. The calendar showed October 15th, but my mind was a blank canvas with inexplicable gaps. 2 entire days had vanished from my memory, as if surgically excised by some malevolent, invisible force. My hands trembled as I examined my reflection in the bathroom mirror. Dark circles beneath my eyes suggested exhaustion, but something more sinister lurked behind my gaze, a haunting uncertainty that threatened to consume my sanity. I work as an investigative journalist for the Boston Chronicle, specializing in uncovering hidden truths. Ironically, now I was confronting a mystery that struck far too close to home. My meticulous nature, which had served me well in countless investigations, now turned inward, dissecting the fragments of my fractured memory. The last thing I clearly remembered was driving through the rural outskirts of New Hampshire, researching a story about unexplained local phenomena. My notes were scattered across my home office, photographs, newspaper clippings, and hastily scribbled observations. But the pages from those missing days were conspicuously absent. My wife Emma noticed my distress immediately. "Stephen, you've been acting strange since you returned from your assignment," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "Are you feeling all right?" I couldn't bring myself to explain the growing terror that was consuming me. How could I describe the growing sensation that something fundamental had been altered within me? Strange images flickered at the edges of my consciousness: a desolate roadside, an abandoned building with peculiar geometric patterns, a sound that was neither human nor natural. These fragments refused to coalesce into a coherent memory. Little did I know that my investigation into those missing hours would lead me down a path of psychological horror that would challenge the very foundations of my understanding of reality. My first step was to consult Dr. Eleanor Blake, a psychiatrist specializing in memory disorders. Her office, nestled in a quiet Boston medical complex, felt both sterile and oppressive. "2 completely missing days are unusual, Mr. Morgan," she said, reviewing my initial assessment. "No signs of physical trauma, no evidence of substance abuse. Your medical records are clean." Her professional demeanor masked a growing intrigue. I noticed how her eyes lingered on my hands, which were involuntarily tracing strange geometric patterns on her desk. "Do you remember anything unusual before the blackout?" she probed. Fragments emerged. A lonely highway in New Hampshire. Fog rolling unexpectedly. A structure in the distance that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. A sound not quite mechanical, not quite organic. Dr. Blake recommended a series of cognitive tests and suggested hypnotic regression. "Sometimes," she explained, "the mind protects itself by blocking traumatic memories." "What trauma?" I couldn't recall anything frightening. And yet, something fundamental had changed within me. My colleague Tom Weston from the Chronicle became my unexpected ally. "I've heard whispers," he said during our clandestine meeting, about strange occurrences in rural New Hampshire. Locals speak of missing time, unexplained phenomena. The investigation was beginning to take shape, but each answer only multiplied my questions. The journey back to New Hampshire felt like retracing a nightmare. Each mile brought more fragmented memories, glimpses that vanished the moment I tried to focus on them. Jack Gardner, the weathered owner of a roadside motel near the area of my suspected memory loss, recognized me instantly. "You were here before," he said, his voice carrying an unsettling undertone. "Something happened to you." His motel sat at the intersection of two forgotten highways, surrounded by dense pine forests that seemed to absorb sound. Strange geometric markings adorned the walls of my previous room, intricate patterns that appeared almost mathematical, yet profoundly alien. Dr. Blake's hypnosis sessions revealed disturbing details. Under trance, I described a structure of neither building nor organic form that seemed to exist between perception and reality. Strange symbols flickered at its edges, mathematical equations that hurt to comprehend. "Your brain is registering something beyond standard perception," Dr. Blake noted clinically. "These aren't hallucinations. They're something else." My wife Emma grew increasingly concerned. The geometric patterns I unconsciously drew matched ancient symbols found in obscure anthropological texts, symbols associated with theoretical quantum anomalies and interdimensional theories. Something was watching. Something was waiting. The convergence happened unexpectedly. During a stormy night, the symbols I had been drawing began to pulse with an inner luminescence. Mathematical patterns transformed, revealing a complex landscape that existed beyond conventional perception. Tom Weston's research provided a crucial piece. He discovered historical accounts of similar incidents in the region, travelers reporting lost time, strange geometric encounters, and psychological disruptions that defied scientific explanation. "These aren't random occurrences," Tom whispered during our late-night meeting. "They're calculated. Deliberate." The structure from my fragmented memories began to take shape. Not a building, not a machine, something that existed between dimensions. Quantum physicists might call it a probability nexus. I understood it as a predatory consciousness that consumed moments of human experience. My investigation was no longer just personal. It had become a fight against an entity that manipulated human perception like a child playing with malleable clay. Dr. Blake's final session revealed the most terrifying truth: these entities didn't just observe. They selected. They harvested. And I was their chosen subject. Reality fractured on the night of October 20th. The entity revealed itself not as a physical being, but as a mathematical probability, a consciousness that existed between quantum states. My 2 missing days were merely its preliminary experiment, a calibration of human perception. I understood now that we were never truly observers. We were subjects. Specimens. The final revelation came with terrifying simplicity. These interdimensional predators didn't consume time. They consumed potential. Every moment they extracted represented countless unborn realities, infinite possibilities collapsed into a single, sterile data point. Emma found me that morning. I was sitting motionless, my body present but my consciousness scattered across impossible geometries. Mathematical symbols covered every surface of our home, walls, floors, even my own skin. "Stephen?" she asked. But the name meant nothing. I was no longer Stephen Morgan, investigative journalist. I was a conduit. A bridge between dimensions. A warning. To those who might find this record, they are watching. They are waiting. And time is not what you believe it to be. Night Pass in New Hampshire. It was just after 10 o'clock when I turned onto the narrow mountain pass, leaving the soft glow of the small New Hampshire town behind me. The GPS on my dashboard insisted this was the fastest route to the inn I had booked for the weekend. I hesitated for a moment before pressing the gas pedal, watching the headlights carve two shaky beams into the impenetrable darkness of the forest ahead. The mountains rose like giants, shrouded in mist, their outlines barely visible against the starless sky. I hadn't planned to drive so late, but the meeting at the office ran longer than expected. What was supposed to be a leisurely evening drive had turned into a solitary journey along a winding, desolate road. The air was colder than I'd expected for October, and a creeping fog seemed to gather at the edges of the asphalt, swirling in eerie patterns as my tires sliced through it. For the first few miles, I was struck by the oppressive quiet of the place. The engine hummed steadily, a comforting reminder of the modern world I'd left behind. But beyond that, there was nothing, no chirping crickets, no rustling branches, not even the distant cry of an owl. It felt as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. I glanced in the rearview mirror. My taillights illuminated only an endless stretch of empty road behind me. No cars, no signs of life. The realization unsettled me more than I cared to admit. Wasn't this supposed to be a popular route? A shortcut, the GPS claimed. So where was everyone else? The first twist in the road came suddenly, forcing me to slow down. The asphalt curved sharply into the shadow of towering pines, their branches interlocked above like skeletal fingers, blotting out what little light the night might have offered. As I navigated the turn, I thought I saw movement at the corner of my vision, a flicker of something pale against the dark trees. My heart skipped, and I instinctively jerked my gaze toward the spot, but there was nothing there. Just the thick forest, stretching endlessly into the night. I shook my head, laughing nervously at my jumpiness. "It's just your imagination," I muttered. Still, a sense of unease clung to me, refusing to let go. I adjusted the radio for some distraction, but all it offered was a low hum of static. Great. Just what I needed, a dead zone. With no signal and no one to call, I was completely on my own out here. As the road straightened, I focused on the path ahead, the rhythmic sound of my tires on the asphalt becoming a kind of mantra. But no matter how much I tried to shake it, I couldn't escape the sensation that something unseen was watching from the darkness. The further I drove, the more the landscape seemed to close in around me. Towering pines lined both sides of the road, their dense, tangled branches arching overhead like a cathedral made of shadows. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving only my headlights to push back the encroaching darkness. The beams revealed glimpses of the road ahead, but beyond their reach, the forest seemed endless and impenetrable. Occasionally, I caught sight of jagged boulders jutting out from the earth like the bones of the mountain itself. Patches of mist clung to the ground, twisting and swirling in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if the fog were alive and reaching for the car. The air inside the vehicle grew colder, and I turned up the heat, though it did little to dispel the chill settling in my chest. The quiet was unnatural. It wasn't the peaceful stillness of a remote wilderness, but a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed against my ears. No rustling leaves, no nocturnal calls, just the low hum of the car engine and the crunch of gravel whenever my tires veered slightly off the narrow road. As the road curved again, I noticed something odd. The trees ahead seemed to shift in the shadows. At first, I dismissed it as an illusion caused by the interplay of headlights and mist, but the movement felt deliberate. A faint sense of dread prickled at the back of my neck, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter than I realized. I rolled down the window slightly, hoping the cool air would help clear my head. Instead, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filled the car, mingling with something faintly metallic. It was an acrid, biting smell I couldn't place, but it set my nerves on edge. I tried to rationalize my unease. It was just a lonely stretch of road, I told myself, and I was tired after a long day. But no matter how many times I repeated it, the tension in my chest refused to ease. Suddenly, I caught sight of something on the side of the road. It was small, pale, and round, a rock, I thought at first. But as I passed it, I could have sworn it moved, shifting slightly as though it had been watching me. My stomach tightened, and I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the object was gone, swallowed by the fog. I laughed nervously, though the sound rang hollow in the oppressive quiet. Just tired, I murmured to myself. Just tired. Yet, deep down, I couldn't shake the growing certainty that I wasn't alone. The miles crawled by, each turn of the road revealing more of the same endless forest. My hands ached from gripping the wheel, and my eyes strained to pierce the murky darkness ahead. I rolled my shoulders, trying to shake off the creeping fatigue, when a sound reached my ears, soft at first, barely distinguishable over the hum of the engine. It was rhythmic, almost like a metronome. Tap, tap, tap. It seemed distant, muffled, yet insistent, as though it were coming from far away, carried on the wind. I frowned, leaning forward slightly to listen. Could it be dripping water? Branches knocking together in the breeze? But there was no wind, and the air was dry. The sound continued, faint and steady, keeping pace with my car. I adjusted the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me, but there was only the empty road stretching into the fog. I pressed my lips together, unease prickling at the back of my neck. I turned the radio dial again, hoping for music or even static to drown out the noise, but the speakers remained stubbornly silent. The rhythmic tap 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 grew louder, more distinct, as if it were approaching. My foot eased off the accelerator, and the car slowed, the sound now mingling with the crunch of gravel beneath my tires. I rolled the window down a crack, hoping to pinpoint its source, but the cool air only brought more silence. Still, the noise persisted, faint but unmistakable. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't coming from the car, and it wasn't the tires. It sounded almost like footsteps. My throat tightened, and I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was ridiculous. Footsteps in the middle of nowhere, keeping pace with a moving car? The idea was absurd. And yet, the rhythm was so deliberate, so unnatural, that I couldn't shake it. I flicked on the high beams, hoping to illuminate whatever was making the noise, but the forest remained empty. The light reached farther into the trees, revealing their gnarled branches and moss-covered trunks, but there was nothing, no animals, no people, no movement. The sound stopped. I blinked, waiting for it to return, but the night was silent again, as if the forest were holding its breath. I exhaled shakily, forcing a laugh. See? Nothing there, I whispered, though the reassurance felt hollow. As I rolled the window back up and pressed on, I couldn't help but glance in the mirrors every few seconds, my pulse quickening with each check. Somewhere deep down, I knew the sound hadn't been my imagination. And worse, I had the unsettling feeling that whatever had made it wasn't gone. The road twisted sharply ahead, disappearing into the darkness like a snake curling into the earth. My eye beams lit up the asphalt and the surrounding trees, revealing nothing but the same misty, silent landscape. I leaned forward slightly, my grip on the wheel still tight. My pulse had only just begun to settle when something darted across the road. It was quick, a dark blur that passed through the edge of my headlights and vanished into the trees on the other side. My foot instinctively tapped the brake, and the car jerked slightly as I slowed down, eyes scanning the area where it had disappeared. A deer, I thought. Or maybe a coyote. It had to be something like that, something normal. My mind tried to latch onto the idea, but I couldn't shake the impression that the shape had been wrong. Too tall, too thin. I frowned, shaking my head. The adrenaline from earlier was clearly messing with me. The shadow had moved so fast, almost like it had been waiting for me to approach before sprinting out. My headlights had only caught a fleeting glimpse, not enough to make out details, just the suggestion of long, spindly limbs and a strange, fluid motion. Probably just an animal, I muttered under my breath, but my voice sounded unconvincing even to myself. Animals move like that all the time, especially in the mountains, right? I turned my gaze back to the road and pressed the gas pedal lightly, urging the car forward. Still, my eyes kept flicking to the trees on either side, searching for any sign of the creature. The forest was dense, the underbrush thick and dark, making it impossible to see more than a few feet beyond the road's edge. The car's interior suddenly felt too quiet. The absence of sound pressed in on me, amplifying the soft hum of the engine and the occasional pop of gravel under the tires. I turned the heater dial up again, hoping the white noise would drown out the growing unease in my chest. It was just a deer, I told myself firmly this time, forcing my hands to relax on the wheel. Nothing to get worked up about. But no matter how much I tried to push the thought away, an image lingered in the back of my mind, the dark, elongated shadow cutting through the beams of light. It hadn't moved like any animal I'd ever seen. The car's heater whirred softly, doing little to dispel the chill that seemed to have seeped into my very bones. I kept driving, but my attention was fractured, my eyes darting between the rearview mirror, the side windows, and the shadows crowding the road ahead. The image of the strange shadow crossing the road replayed in my mind, its movements unnatural, almost deliberate. As the road straightened out, I allowed myself to breathe a little easier. The rhythm of my tires against the asphalt became a lifeline, grounding me in the ordinary, reminding me there was nothing to fear. It was just a dark road, nothing more. And then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. My breath caught. The sound was louder this time, distinct and rhythmic, as if something, or someone, was deliberately pacing alongside me. I swallowed hard and tightened my grip on the wheel, glancing out the driver's side window. The forest blurred past in a wall of black and gray, revealing nothing. I pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine growling as the car sped up. The sound didn't fade. It was closer now, keeping pace with me despite my increased speed. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a mechanical issue? A rock stuck in the tire tread? I forced myself to check the dashboard, no warning lights. The car was running perfectly. The tapping grew louder, and this time it wasn't just a noise. I felt it, a faint vibration that seemed to echo through the car's frame. My fingers trembled on the wheel. Stay calm, I whispered to myself, my voice shaky. I reached for the window switch, hesitating for a moment before lowering it just enough to let in the outside air. The icy wind whipped through the crack, carrying with it a faint but distinct sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was unmistakable now, footsteps. Long, deliberate, and unnervingly steady. They didn't falter, didn't hurry, as if the thing making them knew there was no need to rush. Panic bubbled up in my chest as I rolled the window back up, shutting out the sound. I glanced at the side mirrors, the rearview mirror, even the road ahead, but saw nothing. The tapping persisted, now faintly audible even through the closed window. I pressed the accelerator down again, my speedometer climbing past 50, 60, 70 miles per hour. The road twisted and turned dangerously, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was out there. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the gnawing fear that no matter how fast I drove, it wouldn't be enough. The engine's low hum was the only sound in the world as the car sped down the winding road. I realized, with a sudden pang of dread, just how quiet everything had become. The earlier absence of natural sounds, the rustle of leaves, the call of distant owls, had felt eerie but not impossible. Now, the silence was different. It felt absolute, like the entire forest had been smothered under an invisible blanket. Even the wind seemed to have died. The fog outside clung to the trees like a living thing, thick and unmoving, and the towering pines no longer swayed in the breeze. My headlights illuminated only their still, skeletal forms as I drove. I turned off the heater, hoping to catch some sound, any sound, from outside. But there was nothing. No crackle of gravel under the tires, no faint buzz of insects, not even the echo of the car's movement through the quiet night. The silence pressed against the windows, oppressive and unnatural, making the enclosed space of the vehicle feel even smaller. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as a primal instinct whispered to me that something was wrong, deeply wrong. I reached for the radio again, twisting the dial desperately. Still nothing. Static had been bad enough earlier, but now even that was gone. I tapped the dashboard in frustration, the faint noise startling in the otherwise oppressive quiet. "Come on," I muttered, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the confined space. Outside, the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, each mile identical to the last. The trees grew closer, their trunks crowding the edges of the asphalt, as though the forest itself were leaning in, watching. The fog swirled thickly around the beams of my headlights, swallowing the world beyond a few dozen feet. I tried to focus on driving, on the repetitive rhythm of turning the wheel, navigating the curves. But the silence was all-encompassing now, a vacuum that made my every movement feel amplified. It wasn't just quiet. It was a void, a complete absence of sound so unnatural it sent shivers down my spine. It felt as though the forest itself had stopped breathing. Or maybe it was holding its breath, waiting. For what? I didn't want to find out. I squinted into the fog, my hands gripping the wood tightly. The high beams seemed to push against the mist rather than cut through it, leaving the road ahead obscured. I leaned forward instinctively, as though getting closer to the windshield would somehow give me clarity. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a dark shape at the edge of the headlight's reach, barely more than a smudge against the fog. But as I drove closer, the figure became more distinct. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with impossibly long limbs that moved in a slow, deliberate rhythm. It was walking toward the road. I felt my stomach clench as my brain scrambled to make sense of what I was seeing. A person? Maybe some poor hiker who'd lost their way in the forest? But the proportions were wrong. The arms swung low, almost to the knees, and the legs, oh God, the legs seemed to stretch unnaturally long, each step covering far more ground than it should. I slowed the car, my foot hovering over the brake. The figure continued its path, its gait unnervingly smooth, as though its movements weren't entirely human. Its head was slightly bowed, the details of its face obscured by the fog and distance. My instinct screamed at me to stop, to turn the car around and head back the way I came. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. A deep, bone-chilling unease rooted me to the spot, and for a moment I could only watch as it drew closer to the road. The headlights caught it more clearly now, revealing a gaunt silhouette clad in something dark and tattered. The material clung to its impossibly thin frame, flapping slightly as it moved. Its feet, if it had any, made no sound against the ground, and yet I was certain I could feel those deliberate steps in my chest, like the faint echo of distant thunder. It reached the edge of the road and stopped. My breath hitched, and my hands trembled on the steering wheel. The figure stood perfectly still, its tall, spindly frame almost blending into the trees behind it. I stared at it, waiting for it to move, to do something. Then, slowly, it turned its head toward me. I couldn't see its eyes, or maybe it didn't have any, but the weight of its gaze was undeniable. A primal fear gripped me, the kind that made my entire body scream to flee. But I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped in the suffocating silence of that moment as the thing on the edge of the road seemed to assess me. And then it took a step forward. My heart slammed against my ribs, my breath shallow and quick, but I refused to move. The figure remained still, staring into the car with that unsettling, unblinking presence. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear my vision, my mind racing. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears, drowning out any rational thought. I swallowed hard, forcing my hands to loosen on the wheel. There was no way this was real. This couldn't be real. My mind frantically searched for explanations, anything to explain what I was seeing. It was just a trick of the light. Maybe some weird optical illusion. The fog, the headlights, they were distorting things, making ordinary objects look strange and unfamiliar. Get a grip, I muttered to myself, trying to sound more confident than I felt. It's just a shadow. A weird shadow. I took a deep breath, staring at the figure in the distance, still motionless. I could feel the pulse of my heartbeat in my throat, but I forced myself to keep my gaze locked on it. There had to be some logical explanation. Maybe it was an old tree stump or a large rock, the shape thrown off by the angle of the headlights. Yes, that had to be it. I squeezed my eyes shut for a brief moment and then opened them again, praying that when I looked back, the shape would be gone. The forest would return to its quiet, fog-filled normalcy. But it wasn't gone. It was still there. I could see it more clearly now, the faint outline of its form still tall and unnervingly thin, still standing motionless at the edge of the road. No. I had to be imagining things. There was no way this was happening. I shook my head, willing myself to focus. The mind could play tricks, especially in the dark, especially with the kind of isolation I'd been driving through. All the swirling thoughts, the tension, the silence, it was messing with me. Maybe I was just exhausted. I hadn't slept well the night before, and this long stretch of driving through the mountains wasn't helping. My eyes were playing tricks on me. I leaned forward again, squinting hard at the figure. It was an illusion. A trick of light and fog. Nothing more. Just keep driving, I told myself. Keep going. There's nothing there. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, still keeping one eye on the figure in the rearview mirror. But as the car moved forward, a cold feeling crept up my spine. I wasn't convinced. I didn't feel safe. I forced myself to look ahead, focusing on the road, trying to push away the sense that the thing, whatever it was still out there, watching me. I pressed the accelerator harder, trying to convince myself that if I just kept moving, I'd leave whatever was out there behind. But as I looked up again, I felt the unmistakable dread creep back into my chest. The figure was closer now. Too close. At first, I thought it was the fog, just an illusion, the kind of trick that only happens when the mind gets too tired, when the darkness starts to play with you. But the shape was too distinct to ignore now. Too real. It was moving toward the road with an almost unnatural purpose, each step long and measured, its height towering above anything human. I slowed down involuntarily, the car coasting to a near crawl. My breath hitched as the headlights illuminated more of it, revealing the full scope of its disturbing form. The figure's legs were unnaturally long, far too long for any normal person, and each stride it took seemed to cover more ground than should have been possible. The legs stretched in ways that were grotesque, bending and reaching with an impossible fluidity. My pulse quickened, and a wave of nausea swept through me. It wasn't just tall. It was wrong. The way its limbs moved was unnatural, like some grotesque marionette being controlled by invisible strings. The long, gangly legs seemed to stretch on forever, and the torso, if it even had one, was too thin to support the extremities. I swallowed hard, trying to pull my gaze away, but it was impossible. The figure was so tall now that it loomed over the edge of the road, almost within reach of the car. I could make out more details in the pale glow of the headlights. Its arms hung loosely by its sides, unnaturally long, swinging in a way that made it seem more insect-like than human. There was something about its posture, so impossibly straight, so rigid, that made it look more like an object than a person. I tried to convince myself that I was just seeing things, that it was an optical illusion brought on by the fog and my exhaustion, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. My mind reeled, grasping for an explanation that wouldn't involve the truth of what was happening. It wasn't human. The figure took another step, moving even closer, and I felt the car shudder slightly beneath me. My breathing became shallow, erratic. I was fighting the urge to slam on the gas and drive away as fast as I could, but something held me there. I was paralyzed, caught between the impulse to escape and the sheer horror of facing something that didn't belong in the world I knew. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The thing was drawing nearer with each passing moment, its eerie stride bringing it closer and closer to the road, and to me. I couldn't take it anymore. The cold grip of fear that had settled on my chest was suffocating. My hands trembled as they clutched the steering wheel, and my breath came in quick, shallow gasps. I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal, the engine roaring to life as the car surged forward. The figure, whatever it was still in my peripheral vision, but I didn't dare look at it directly again. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing the car faster, feeling the tires grip the road as I tried to outrun the terror that clung to me like a second skin. The headlights cut through the fog, revealing more of the empty road ahead. But the fear didn't fade. In fact, it only deepened. The further I drove, the more I realized that I couldn't shake the image of that towering figure, its long limbs stretching out like something out of a nightmare. I had to rationalize. I had to make sense of what I'd seen, because if I didn't, the terror would consume me. It was just a trick of the light, I muttered to myself, trying to sound confident even as my voice wavered. The fog, the headlights. It played with my eyes. Yeah, that was it. A trick of the light. The figure hadn't been real. There was no way something that unnatural could exist in the real world. It was just a product of the isolation, the silence, and the dark. The road, the fog, it was all messing with my head. I tried to steady my breath as the car picked up speed, the engine's hum drowning out the sound of my racing heartbeat. I gripped the wheels so tightly my knuckles were white, but I refused to slow down. The farther I got from that thing, the better. Don't be stupid, I scolded myself, shaking my head. You're just exhausted. It's been a long drive, and your mind's playing tricks. You'll get to the next town, and you'll forget about this. It'll all be fine. But even as I spoke the words, doubt gnawed at me. I couldn't dismiss what I had seen. The figure's legs, impossibly long and disturbing, its posture unnervingly stiff. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't a figment of my imagination. I knew what I had seen. I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that same towering shape looming behind me. But there was nothing. Just the empty stretch of road. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of relief. Maybe I had outrun it. Maybe it was all just some kind of twisted hallucination. But the relief didn't last long. The deep, gnawing feeling in my gut, an instinct I couldn't ignore, told me it wasn't over. Not yet. The road ahead blurred into the fog, and I pushed the car faster, desperate to leave that place behind. The steady hum of the engine beneath me was the only sound that made sense now. I clung to it, focusing on the rhythm, the movement of the car beneath my hands. The steering wheel felt reassuringly solid, and with each passing mile, I forced my thoughts away from what I had seen. I kept telling myself that it was over, that I had left whatever it was behind. The road ahead was empty, just asphalt and trees, cloaked in a thick fog. I couldn't see much beyond the headlights' reach, but it was something. It was normal. It was safe. I tried to breathe slowly, deliberately. In and out. A few deep breaths, just to calm my racing heart. The last thing I needed was to lose control of the car because I couldn't think straight. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. I had to stay focused. Just keep driving, I muttered under my breath. It sounded stupid, but saying it out loud gave me a small measure of comfort. As long as I kept moving, as long as I kept my eyes on the road, I could get through this. The headlights cut through the fog, illuminating the twisting road ahead. Each curve seemed sharper, more sudden than the last. It made me grip the wheel tighter, my knuckles turning pale. The trees on either side of the road looked like dark shadows, looming figures that closed in with each bend, threatening to swallow the car whole. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see the figure, its impossibly long limbs moving toward me, but there was nothing. Just the dark, empty road behind. You're being paranoid, I told myself. It's all in your head. You're just tired. Nothing's out there. But even as I said it, I wasn't convinced. There was something about the way the fog clung to everything, about the oppressive silence that pressed in from all sides, that made the world feel off. The isolation, the stillness, it was like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting. I tried to push that thought aside, focusing on the road. Focus on the drive. Stay calm. I turned the radio dial again, hoping for some distraction. The static returned in bursts, a crackling hiss that made the silence even more unbearable. I cursed under my breath, twisting the dial to try and find something, anything, that would fill the void. Nothing. Just the static. I sighed, letting go of the dial. The silence was back, and it seemed even more oppressive now. It pressed against the windows like it was alive, trying to crawl into the car with me. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong, that I was still being watched. I shook my head. No, I whispered firmly to myself. You're fine. It's just a bad stretch of road. Just a bad night. That's all. I tried to focus on the miles ahead, but the unease, deep and unshakable, continued to gnaw at the edges of my mind. I tried to steady my breathing, but the uneasy feeling in my stomach wouldn't fade. The car was my only connection to normality now, the steady purr of the engine beneath me, the tires gripping the road, the soft glow of the headlights cutting through the fog. But, like everything else, it wasn't immune to the creeping sense of wrongness that had settled over me. It started with a faint hum, low and almost imperceptible. I glanced at the dashboard, frowning. The radio was off. I didn't remember turning it on. The sound grew louder, a hissing crackle that filled the quiet like the buzzing of an insect too close to the ear. My hand instinctively reached for the radio dial, twisting it down in an attempt to turn the static off. But the noise didn't stop. It only seemed to get louder. I slammed the knob down again, but the static continued, cutting through the silence with an intensity that made my teeth ache. My pulse quickened as I stared at the dial, now completely silent except for the crackling hiss. My fingers hovered over the controls, trying desperately to find something, anything, to bring back some sense of normalcy. But it wasn't working. I felt the weight of my growing anxiety pressing on me, suffocating me, as the static grew louder still. Then, as if mocking my panic, the car's headlights flickered. Just a brief flash, but enough to make my heart jump in my chest. For a moment, the road ahead seemed to disappear, leaving me blind in the darkness, the headlights cutting in and out. The light bounced off the thick fog, adding to the distortion, and for a split second, it felt like I was driving through some otherworldly space, cut off from everything, with no way out. I slammed my foot on the brake, the tires screeching against the asphalt, but nothing changed. The headlights flickered again, the brief flashes of light revealing nothing more than shadowy trees and empty road. I breathed deeply, forcing my hands to steady themselves on the wheel. This was just mechanical. Some kind of electrical malfunction. It was nothing. I was overreacting. I let go of the brake, pressing the gas again, and the headlights stayed on this time. But the static on the radio was still there, creeping under my skin, rattling my nerves. I felt like something was watching me, or worse, like I was inside something, some dark, distorted space that didn't belong in the world I knew. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was still empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone on the road. The static was still there, as loud and intrusive as ever. The headlights flickered again, briefly illuminating the trees, then going dark, then lighting up again. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying to ignore the rising panic. It was just a malfunction. Just a malfunction. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. The unease gnawed at me, growing stronger with each passing second. Something was wrong. Something was off, and I couldn't explain it. The static on the radio still buzzed in my ears, a relentless hum that only deepened the growing sense of dread. The headlights flickered once more, the eerie light casting strange, fleeting shadows along the road. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to focus. I couldn't let the fear take hold. Not again. But as I glanced into the rearview mirror, my heart stopped. There, just outside the reach of my headlights, stood the figure. It was the same one, the tall, unnatural shape I'd seen before. The one with those impossibly long legs. I blinked hard, trying to clear the fog in my mind, but the figure didn't disappear. It stood there, motionless, by the side of the road. The same unnerving posture. The same elongated limbs. Its shadow stretched long and distorted, like a reflection warped in a broken mirror. I almost didn't want to believe it. I wanted to tell myself that it was another trick of the light, that my mind was playing tricks on me after everything I'd seen. But the truth gnawed at the back of my mind. It was real. I pressed my foot down harder on the gas, speeding up, desperate to get away, but my eyes kept flicking back to the rearview mirror. The figure didn't move. It didn't even flinch as the car passed it. It just stood there, still and silent, watching me. I turned my head sharply, eyes scanning the road ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, lingering just behind me, waiting. I forced myself to look ahead, focus on the road. But my hands were shaking, my grip on the wheel so tight that my knuckles ached. The car surged forward, but I couldn't shake the thought of that figure, standing alone on the side of the road, staring. I didn't dare glance in the rearview mirror again. What if it had moved? What if it was following me now? The engine hummed, but it sounded distant, almost muffled. My breath came faster, shallow. I was sweating, but the cold seemed to press in from all sides, as if the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. The fog outside swirled and danced in the headlights, thick and suffocating. I didn't know how much longer I could keep driving like this. Every part of me screamed to stop, to turn back, to find somewhere safe. But I couldn't. I couldn't stop now. I glanced at the rearview mirror once more. The figure was gone. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, that I had finally gone over the edge of reason. But then, as my eyes scanned the dark stretch of road behind me, I saw it again, just a flicker of movement, something tall and unnatural, slipping back into the shadows. It was still there, still watching me. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out the hum of the engine. I was driving too fast, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. The fog pressed in like a suffocating blanket, and my grip on the wheel was so tight it felt like the bones in my fingers were cracking. I couldn't get the image of the figure out of my mind. Its tall, spindly form, too tall, too wrong to be real, had been right there, standing by the road, watching me. But now, as I glanced into the rearview mirror again, it was gone. Nothing but empty road. I exhaled shakily, the tension in my chest not quite relieved. It had vanished. Maybe it was never there at all. Maybe it had just been my overactive imagination playing tricks on me after all the fear and the isolation. But then, why did the air feel so heavy? Why was my heart still hammering in my chest like it was ready to burst? I forced myself to take a slow breath, trying to calm down, trying to make sense of it. I wasn't going crazy. This was just a stretch of bad luck, a bad night. The fog, the weird sounds, my mind had just exaggerated things. The road ahead was still empty, the headlights casting weak light on the twisting path. I kept driving, forcing myself to push the panic down, to focus on the road, but my eyes kept flicking to the mirror. I couldn't help it. I checked again. Nothing. My heart rate started to slow. Maybe it was nothing. I had imagined it. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was still out there, watching me. I heard the static again, low and insistent, crawling up from the radio. It started as a faint buzz, then grew louder, more oppressive, filling the silence with its sharp hiss. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The headlights flickered again, briefly illuminating the trees along the side of the road. My stomach churned as the darkness behind me stretched longer. I gripped the wheel harder, my thoughts spiraling. The figure was gone, but the unease hadn't left. It felt like I was driving through a dream, or worse, a nightmare. Then, there it was again. I caught a glimpse of movement in the rearview mirror. The tall figure, just barely visible at the edge of the trees. It was moving, but not like any person could. It was too fast, too smooth, almost gliding, like it wasn't quite bound by the rules of a world I knew. My breath caught in my throat. No. I was losing it. This wasn't real. But my eyes told a different story. I wasn't alone on this road. That thing was out there, and it was following me. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, the engine roaring louder, the tires screeching as I sped forward, desperate to outrun the terror. The radio static reached a deafening volume, almost like a voice shouting at me, but I couldn't focus on it now. I had to get away. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't keep going like this. The road stretched on endlessly, a dark void that seemed to pull at me, tugging at my sanity. I needed to stop, to breathe, to ground myself in something real. The static in the radio had grown unbearable, like a pressure building in my skull. My eyes flickered to the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see the tall figure again, creeping ever closer. But nothing but the endless road. The fog. The night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just behind me, watching me. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, but I knew I couldn't outrun the fear. Not this time. I had to stop. I had to find somewhere, anywhere, where I could be with people, where I could feel safe. And then, like some cruel twist of fate, I saw the glow of neon lights ahead, a small diner by the side of the road. The sign flickered, the letters spelling out open 24 hours. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I pulled the car into the gravel parking lot, the tires crunching under the weight of my fear. My headlights illuminated the diner's sign and the old-fashioned, weathered building. A few cars were parked outside, their owners hidden inside, probably seeking warmth and comfort that I could only dream of. I parked and killed the engine, the sudden silence pressing in on me. I sat in the car for a moment, taking a few shallow breaths. I had to calm down. Just a few minutes in there, I told myself. Maybe a cup of coffee would clear my head. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, the unease in my chest remained. It clung to me, thick and heavy. Still, I forced myself to open the door, step out, and walk toward the diner. The gravel crunched under my feet, the cold air biting at my skin, but I didn't care. I needed something normal. Something to remind me that the world outside wasn't as twisted as the fear gnawing at me. The door chimed as I pushed it open, and the warmth inside hit me immediately. The low murmur of conversation, the clink of silverware, the smell of fresh coffee, these things should have been reassuring. And yet, as I stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that the safety I was looking for was a fleeting illusion. I scanned the room, my eyes lingering on the few customers scattered at the tables. None of them paid me any mind. Just a trucker at the counter, a couple of late-night travelers in the corner booth. The staff moved in their practiced, tired way, but there was something about the place that felt off. I sat at the counter, keeping my back to the door. I didn't want to look outside again. Not yet. A waitress, young but with tired eyes, came over. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice flat, the words like an echo in the dim light. "Just coffee," I replied, my voice shaking despite myself. She nodded, almost absent-mindedly, and turned away to pour the coffee. I watched her, trying to push down the trembling in my hands. I took a deep breath, focusing on the cup in front of me as she slid it across the counter. I wrapped my fingers around the warm mug, feeling the heat seep into my skin. The normalcy of the gesture should have been comforting, should have made everything feel okay. But I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. Something was out there, waiting. And no amount of coffee, no dimly lit diner, no soft chatter around me could change that. I took a sip, the bitter taste grounding me for a second, but my mind kept drifting. Could I really stay here? Could I stay long enough to feel safe? Or was the figure out there, still waiting, still watching, just beyond the reach of the diner's lights? My eyes flicked to the window, the faint glow of the streetlights outside casting long shadows across the parking lot. The door swung open with a soft chime, and I stepped into the warmth of the diner, the sudden shift from the cold night air almost jarring. The cozy, dim-lit interior should have offered some relief, but the tension still coiled in my chest, tight and unyielding. The smell of sizzling food and fresh coffee filled the air, but I barely noticed it. My mind kept drifting back to the figure on the road, to the static, to the sense of being watched. I walked past the counter and chose an empty booth by the window. I wanted to sit with my back against the wall, facing the entrance, just in case. Something about the place felt off. I couldn't shake the nagging sensation that I wasn't supposed to be here, that I didn't belong. I slid into the booth and kept my eyes on the door, scanning the dim room for any sign of danger, anything that might explain the feeling of impending doom. But the diner appeared completely ordinary. The tired faces of the few patrons, the half-eaten plates of food, the soft clink of silverware, all of it felt like the mundane normalcy I craved, yet it did nothing to soothe the raw fear inside me. The waitress, a young woman with dark circles under her eyes, approached and set a cup of coffee in front of me without a word. She didn't even look me in the eye. She was too busy, too lost in her own world to care. That was fine. I didn't want to talk to anyone. Not yet. I wrapped my fingers around the warm mug, trying to steady myself, but my gaze wandered once again to the few other patrons. One man caught my attention. He sat at the far end of the counter, alone, dressed in an old flannel shirt and worn jeans. His face was weathered, with deep lines marking a life spent outdoors, but it wasn't his appearance that stood out. It was the way he watched me. His eyes, dark and unreadable, locked onto mine the moment I looked up. There was something unsettling in the way he stared, an intensity that was hard to ignore. He didn't smile or look away, just kept his gaze fixed on me with an unsettling calm. I shifted uncomfortably, averting my eyes to the coffee in front of me. I could feel his eyes still on me, heavy, like a weight pressing against my chest. Then, just as I thought I might be imagining it, he slowly stood up from his stool and made his way over to my booth. His steps were measured, deliberate, like someone who had walked this road 100 times before. I watched him approach, my heart thudding in my chest, and when he reached my table, he slid into the seat across from me without asking. The sudden closeness made me tense up, but I didn't move. He studied me silently for a moment, his dark eyes never wavering. Then, in a voice that was rough and low, he spoke. "You're not from around here." It wasn't a question, just an observation, but it felt like a warning. I nodded, swallowing hard. "No, I'm not," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. He leaned in just a little, his eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't be on this road at night." The words hit me like a jolt of ice. My throat tightened, and I tried to suppress the shiver that ran down my spine. I forced myself to meet his gaze, but I couldn't shake the unease in my stomach. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound calm, but my voice betrayed me. He glanced over his shoulder, as if making sure no one was listening. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he leaned closer. "There's things out there," he muttered, his voice low, barely a whisper. "Things that shouldn't be." The air between us grew thick with tension. His words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and ominous. He didn't explain further, just stared at me as if daring me to ask more. I swallowed, not sure what to say. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The image of the tall, twisted figure flashed in my mind, and I couldn't help but ask, What things?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, his eyes flickering to the window, then back to me. "You won't see it at first," he said, his voice barely audible above the hum of the diner. "But it'll find you. It always does." I stared at him, trying to make sense of his words. Was he drunk? Or just some crazy local? Before I could ask more, he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Best get some rest while you can," he said gruffly, his eyes meeting mine one last time. "That road's no place for anyone at night." And then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the diner. The door chimed again as he left, and I was left sitting in the booth, stunned and confused, the weight of his words pressing down on me. What was he talking about? What was he warning me about? I glanced toward the door, half expecting the figure to be standing just outside, watching. But the parking lot was empty. The night was still, silent. For a moment, the diner seemed almost too quiet, as if the world had stopped breathing. I sat there, alone with my thoughts, the stranger's warning echoing in my mind. The door chimed again as the stranger left, but his presence lingered in the air like a dark cloud. I sat there for a moment, unsure of what to do, my mind racing. His words, "Things that shouldn't be, it always finds you," echoed in my head like a broken record. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see him standing outside, watching, but the parking lot was still, empty under the faint glow of the streetlights. I sipped my coffee, trying to steady my nerves. The warmth of the cup in my hands did little to calm the chill running through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that there was something more to the stranger's warning than just local superstition. A few minutes passed before the waitress returned to check on me. She gave me a polite smile, but I couldn't bring myself to ask her about the man who had just left. Maybe she didn't even know him. Maybe he was just a local who liked to sit in the diner and spout cryptic warnings to strangers. But something in his eyes had made me believe him. Something in the way he spoke, as if he had seen or experienced things beyond words. I stood up, feeling the weight of the room settle around me. I needed to leave, to get back on the road, but as I turned to walk out, I heard the soft scrape of a chair being pulled back. The man was back, standing at the counter, looking down at a half-empty coffee cup. His eyes caught mine as I hesitated by the door, and without missing a beat, he spoke again, his voice quieter this time, almost conspiratorial. "You really want to know what's out there?" he asked, his gaze dark and piercing. I froze, heart skipping a beat. There was a weight to his question, like he was daring me to ask. It was a challenge, but also an invitation to dive deeper into something I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. "Legends," he continued, his voice low, barely rising above the hum of the diner. "They've been passed down for years around here. Old stories, mostly. Things people don't like to talk about. But they're true. All of it. Some of them say it's just a fog that messes with your mind, but that's not it. Not really." I took a step toward him, curiosity battling the growing dread in my gut. "What do you mean?" He glanced around the diner quickly, then lowered his voice even more. It's the pass, the old road that cuts through the mountains. It's been cursed for as long as anyone can remember. Some say it's haunted by the souls of those who've vanished there over the years, lost drivers, hikers, people who took a wrong turn and never came back. He paused, his eyes narrowing as if weighing whether to say more. And the creature, he added after a long pause, his gaze shifting toward the window, the tall one you've seen. It's not just a trick of the light. There's a name for it. Some call it the Watcher. I felt a shiver run down my spine at the mention of the creature's name. I had been trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But now, hearing him say it out loud, the Watcher? I asked, almost breathless. He nodded, his lips curling into a grim smile. The stories say it's been stalking the pass for centuries. People say it's not human, but no one really knows what it is. Some think it's a spirit. Others say it's something much older, something darker. But whatever it is, it follows travelers. It knows when you're alone, when you're vulnerable. And it'll follow you, no matter how far you go. It never stops. Never. My throat went dry. I wanted to laugh, to brush it off as madness, but the cold sweat on my skin told me that I was already too far gone. The static on the radio, the flickering headlights, the tall figure in the distance, all of it lined up too perfectly with what the man was saying. But why? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Why does it do this? The man's eyes darkened, and he leaned in just a little closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Some say it feeds on fear, that it waits for people to see it, to feel its presence. And once you do, once it knows you're aware of it, it won't stop. It'll drive you to the edge, make you see things that are real, force you to leave, or worse, to stay, lost in its grip forever. I felt a lump form in my throat, my mind racing as I processed the weight of his words. Do you think it's still out there? I asked, my voice trembling. The man's expression softened, but there was no kindness in it. It's always out there. You just don't see it until it's too late. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to run, to forget this whole night had ever happened. But another part of me, a part one hated, was drawn to the mystery, to the fear that was now crawling under my skin. Before I could speak again, he gave me one last look, intense, knowing, and turned toward the door. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't need to. His warning had been clear enough. And as he stepped out into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. I watched the man leave, his figure disappearing into the night, and for a brief moment, the diner seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief. I tried to shake off the words that had been hanging in the air, but they clung to me like a cold fog wrapping around my mind. The Watcher. I couldn't quite get it out of my head. At first, I wanted to laugh, to dismiss everything he had said as the ramblings of some local eccentric. There were always strange characters in places like this, old folks who believed in ghosts, in curses, in things better left alone. But as I sat back down in my booth, the unsettling feeling I had been trying to suppress came rushing back. I took a sip of my coffee, trying to steady myself, but the liquid tasted like nothing, just a bitter, tasteless reminder of the strange conversation I'd just had. The waitress appeared again, now with a more polite smile, but she didn't seem to notice how my hands shook as I put the cup down. Her shift seemed to be ending, and she was getting ready to leave, gathering her things in silence. I considered asking her if she knew anything about the man who had warned me, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way she had looked at me when she first set the coffee down. Or maybe it was the way the entire diner had seemed to go quiet after his departure. There was something about the place, about the people here, that felt off. I glanced out the window again, half expecting to see the man standing out there in the shadows, watching me. But there was nothing. The night was as still as it had been before, the dark road stretching into the mountains, quiet and empty. But just as I was about to stand up and leave, something caught my eye, a movement outside. I stared harder, trying to make out what it was, but the headlights from my car cast strange, shifting shadows across the parking lot. It could have been nothing. A trick of the light, maybe. Then I noticed it again, the man's warning. He had said that it would follow me, that it was always out there, waiting. The thought made my stomach drop. I shook my head, trying to push the fear back. I was being irrational, I knew it. But as I turned my attention back to the diner, I caught something that stopped me cold. The waitress, now by the door, had paused in the middle of pulling on her coat. She was staring at me. Her eyes were wide, her expression pale. She hadn't seen me look at her until just then, and when she noticed, she quickly turned away, her hands fumbling with her coat buttons. Something in the way she looked at me, like she knew something I didn't, made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I wasn't the only one feeling it. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and approached her at the counter. "Are you all right?" I asked, trying to sound calm, but the question came out more like a demand than I intended. She didn't immediately answer, her back to me as she gathered her things in a hurried motion. Finally, she turned, her face flushed. You shouldn't stay here," she said in a low voice, barely above a whisper. I felt a chill run through me. "What do you mean? What's going on here?" She glanced nervously toward the door. The fear in her eyes was palpable, and it was clear that whatever it was, she was terrified of it. "There's something out there," she said, the words shaky, like she was afraid someone might overhear. "I've seen it. People around here talk about it. We all know not to be out there after dark." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I was starting to understand. The locals, the ones who had lived here their whole lives, they didn't talk about it openly, but they knew. They all knew. I took a step closer, my curiosity now outweighing the unease in my gut. "What have you seen?" She swallowed hard, her eyes darting around, checking the room. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible, as if afraid even the walls might be listening. "I don't know what it is," she said, "but I've heard the stories. The ones who've gone missing, the ones who say they saw something. No one really knows. But I've seen it in the distance, in the shadows. Watching." She stopped, her hands trembling as she clasped her coat tightly. "It doesn't matter if you believe the stories or not. It's real. And it'll find you." Her words hit me like a hammer, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt the weight of something much darker pressing down on me. It wasn't just the stranger. It wasn't just his wild warning. This place, this road, wasn't as safe as it seemed. I took a step back, my heart pounding, unsure of what to say. The waitress quickly turned away, heading for the door, but before she could leave, she turned one last time. "Please," she said, her voice pleading. "Just leave. While you still can." She walked out without another word, leaving me standing there, staring at the door as it swung shut behind her. I was left in the silence of the diner, surrounded by the weight of all that had been said. I wanted to believe it was just superstition, that there was nothing out there waiting for me. But the fear in the waitress's eyes, the same fear in the stranger's voice, it was all too real. And somehow, deep down, I knew it was already too late. I was still standing by the door when the man returned. It wasn't the same casual stroll he had before. This time, there was urgency in his steps, as if he had been holding something back, but now he could no longer keep quiet. The moment I saw him re-enter, the door swinging open with a sharp creak, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing as he approached, and before I could ask him anything, he spoke, his voice low but heavy with warning. "You're still here," he said, more an observation than a question. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The weight of his presence had a way of swallowing any response I might have had. "You shouldn't be," he added quickly, his voice sharper this time, almost panicked. "You need to leave, now, before it's too late." I stepped back instinctively. The urgency in his tone made my pulse race. "What are you talking about?" He didn't answer right away, as if gathering his thoughts, or perhaps looking for the right way to put it. His face was pale, sweat beading along his brow. "There's a reason no one's out on the roads after dark," he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "It's not just stories, not just ghosts. It's real. And if you're still on that road when midnight comes, you'll never leave." I frowned, the air between us heavy with a tension I couldn't ignore. "What do you mean, never leave?" I asked, my voice trembling now despite my best efforts to sound composed. The man shook his head, as if my question was an obvious one. "It's already coming. It's always coming. That thing, the Watcher, it feeds at night, and if you're still on that road after midnight, it'll find you. The pass, the road you're driving on, it's cursed. They say the clock marks its power. Once it strikes 12, the road changes. People disappear, and the ones who survive, they're never the same." I could feel the cold sweat on my back, and my heart raced with a strange combination of fear and disbelief. The man's words were becoming more desperate, but they were tinged with a truth that gnawed at me. I didn't want to believe him, but something in his eyes, something in the way he moved, almost twitchy, made me wonder if there was more to this than I could see. "You need to go now," he repeated, his voice tight. "If you're not off that pass by midnight, you'll wish you had been. It doesn't matter what you believe, what you think is real. Just trust me. Leave now." I felt the impulse to argue, to demand more answers, but the man wasn't giving me any. His eyes were wild now, desperate, and I could tell that something inside him was breaking, maybe from fear, maybe from experience. Whatever it was real. I tried to steady myself, shaking my head. "How do you know all this?" He took a step back, his lips curling into something between a grimace and a half-smile. "I know because I've seen it. I've heard the stories. And I've felt it. The thing that follows you. The thing that doesn't stop. It waits, and it watches. But after midnight, it's not just waiting anymore. It's hunting." His words hit me like a punch to the stomach. The air around me felt suffocating, and for the first time that night, I considered that maybe I wasn't just imagining things. The static on the radio, the flickering lights, the figure in the distance, all of it was starting to make sense in a way I didn't want it to. I took a step toward him, unsure of what I was looking for, an explanation, reassurance, anything that might put my mind at ease. But the man was shaking his head, almost pleading with me. "Please," he said, his voice cracking. "You don't have time. Leave now. You don't want to be out there when the clock strikes midnight." I stared at him, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a storm cloud ready to break. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. There was no logical reason to believe any of this. But in my gut, something told me that the longer I stayed here, the more I risked falling into the nightmare he was describing. I opened the door, the cold night air rushing in as I stepped back outside. The stranger's eyes followed me as I took a hesitant step toward my car. "Don't say I didn't warn you," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the passing cars. I didn't look back. My heart pounded in my chest as I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, the sound of the car's ignition cutting through the stillness of the night. I knew I had to leave. But as I pulled away from the diner and headed back toward the pass, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was already waiting for me out there, somewhere in the dark. And no matter how fast I drove, it would always be just behind me. Always watching. I stood there in the cold night air, the door to the diner still ajar behind me. The sound of the stranger's warning echoed in my head, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. The words "it'll find you" clung to my thoughts, twisting them into something I could barely recognize. For a moment, I thought about driving straight out of the pass, heading south, away from this cursed stretch of road. But then, as quickly as the thought came, it was gone. What if it was just superstition? What if it was all in my head? I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of doubt. I couldn't let myself get swept up in stories and warnings. I wasn't the type to fall for that kind of thing. I glanced at my watch. There was still time before midnight. Just a few more hours of driving, and I'd be out of the mountains and back on a familiar highway. I told myself I was fine, that this was just a strange detour in an otherwise normal trip. But the chill in the air pressed against me, making it harder to ignore the unsettling weight in my chest. I had to keep going. I couldn't let myself be ruled by fear, at least not yet. I took a deep breath and walked back to my car. The headlights of my vehicle flickered slightly, as if greeting me with their own nervous hesitation. As I opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, I felt a strange sense of reluctance, like my body knew something I didn't. I started the engine, and the comforting hum of the car did little to ease the unease that had begun to settle deep within me. The shadows around me seemed to stretch, as though reaching out to pull me back into the night. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying to steady my hands, but my pulse kept quickening. With a final glance at the diner in my rearview mirror, I pulled away, the headlights cutting through the darkness as the road ahead loomed large and endless. The silence of the mountains enveloped me once more. I tried to focus on the road. The familiar curve of the winding pass was only moments away, the path I'd been on for hours now stretching out into the unknown. The only sound in the car was the steady hum of the tires against the asphalt. But my mind kept drifting back to the stranger, to his warning. It's always watching. It waits. Was he just a local trying to scare me off? Or was there something more to his words than I was willing to admit? I tried to rationalize. It was all just superstition, wasn't it? People had been living in these mountains for years. If something truly dangerous existed out here, surely someone would have seen it, or at least talked about it in a way that made sense. But then I remembered the strange figure I'd seen earlier, tall, unnaturally thin, moving in a way that shouldn't have been possible for a human. My chest tightened as I gripped the steering wheel tighter, the doubt creeping in like a shadow. The headlights suddenly flickered again, a harsh flash of light and then darkness, only to return to their normal brightness. I frowned, my heart skipping a beat. The road ahead was still clear, but the nagging feeling in the back of my mind didn't ease. I glanced at my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone there. But there was only the black void of the mountain road behind me, stretching endlessly into the dark. I forced my gaze back to the road in front of me. Keep driving, I told myself. Keep moving forward. But the doubt kept gnawing at me, growing louder with every mile. I wasn't sure if it was fear of what I didn't understand, or something deeper, something primal that told me I wasn't alone. And as I continued on, the shadows around me seemed to grow longer, stretching out in every direction as if the night itself was closing in. The road felt more isolated than it had just hours before, like I was no longer in control of the journey. No, I thought, shaking my head again. I was fine. I just needed to keep moving. I couldn't let myself be scared by stories, by figures in the dark. But the unease wouldn't let go. The quiet hum of the car, the flickering headlights, the strange feeling that someone, or something, was watching me from just beyond the edge of the road. I kept driving, knowing that with every mile, I was getting closer to whatever it was that lurked in the darkness. The miles seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me, the road winding through the darkness like a serpent, undisturbed except for the occasional flicker of my headlights on the asphalt. The night was unnervingly quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife and the rustling of the trees replaced by a suffocating silence that pressed in from all sides. It wasn't the silence itself that was unsettling, it was the feeling that it wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet. Like the world had stopped breathing, waiting for something. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, unable to shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following me. The car felt smaller now, as though the walls were closing in. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, my knuckles white against the black leather. I was moving faster than I had been earlier, but it felt like the road was only getting longer, stretching farther into the dark. The trees that lined the path seemed to loom closer, their twisted branches reaching for the car like skeletal hands. I glanced again at the rearview mirror. Nothing. Just the empty stretch of road behind me, the headlights casting long, thin shadows on the pavement. I exhaled sharply, trying to calm my nerves. It was nothing, I told myself. I had to stop letting my imagination run wild. But then came the feeling again, the creeping sensation that something was there, just beyond the edge of my vision. A shadow, just outside of the beam of light, moving in sync with my car. I turned my head quickly, my eyes scanning the road around me, but there was nothing there. Still, the sensation didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the road ahead was becoming more oppressive. The trees seemed to press in tighter, the path narrowing as though the world was closing in around me. Every glance into the rearview mirror seemed to intensify the sense of something watching, waiting. I shook my head, trying to focus, but my eyes kept darting back to the mirror, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever it was that had been following me. But again, there was nothing, only the black road behind me, stretching endlessly into the night. But that was the problem. It was the nothing that terrified me. The empty road, the stillness that felt unnatural. I pushed the accelerator down, urging the car to move faster. The engine roared to life, the tires gripping the asphalt with a newfound urgency. But as I sped up, so did the tension in the air. The quiet became more deafening, more suffocating, and the shadows along the roadside seemed to grow darker, more foreboding. I looked again. This time, I did see something. A shadow, moving at the edge of the road, just out of reach of the headlights. It was tall, impossibly tall, stretching upward like a dark silhouette against the trees. My heart leaped in my chest, and I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal, my pulse hammering in my ears. The figure was there, no mistake about it. Its shape was unmistakable, the long, thin limbs stretching unnaturally, its presence too still, too rigid. I pressed harder on the gas, the car surging forward, the engine howling. But as I sped away, the shadow moved with me, keeping pace just on the outskirts of the light, always there, always watching. I gritted my teeth, my heart racing, as the figure seemed to match my every move. The faster I drove, the faster it moved. It was as if it was alive, hunting, drawn to me with an unnatural speed. I glanced into the mirror again. This time, I could see it clearly, a tall, thin figure, standing at the side of the road, its limbs impossibly long, its shape twisting unnervingly with every step. My breath caught in my throat. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching in protest as I jerked to a stop. The world around me spun for a moment, and I was left staring at the dark road, panting as if my breath had been stolen from me. But the figure was gone. I waited and waited, but there was nothing. The road was empty again. The night returned to its silent, suffocating stillness. Still shaking, I slowly exhaled, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell was happening? I glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. The panic surged again, my grip on the steering wheel tightening, the reality of the situation settling in. There was no rational explanation for what I was seeing. There was no way I could have imagined it. It was too real, too alive. I had to get off this road. I had to get out of this mountain pass before it was too late. With trembling hands, I put the car back in gear and hit the accelerator again, the engine growling beneath me. The night stretched on, darker now, as if something unseen had descended over the road. The air was thick with tension, every shadow on the road whispering of danger. I didn't know if I could outrun it, whatever it was. But I knew I had to try. My foot pressed harder on the gas pedal as the engine roared, but the weight in my chest only seemed to grow heavier. The road was still empty behind me, just the dark stretch of pavement and the faint glow of my headlights cutting through the blackness. But something didn't feel right. The feeling of being hunted, of being watched, was unbearable. I could see the trees now, tall, dark figures flanking the road like silent sentinels. Their shadows cast long and distorted in the beams of my headlights, stretching unnaturally toward the car, as if they too were trying to reach out and claim me. My eyes darted from one to the other, scanning the tree line, half expecting to see something shift. And then, I saw it. A flicker of movement, too quick to catch at first. My eyes snapped toward it, heart racing as the motion was repeated. A shadow darted through the trees, not just swaying in the wind, but moving, deliberate and fast. The trees shifted with it, branches bending under the weight of something unseen, something far too large to be a mere animal. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my hands shaking on the wheel. I couldn't look away, but at the same time, I knew I had to keep my eyes on the road. But the movement continued, a figure weaving in and out of the trees, too smooth, too calculated. I could feel my pulse thundering in my ears, drying out everything else. Every time I thought I had seen it, it was gone, hidden behind a thick cluster of branches or obscured by the dark shadows. But it was there, moving with the kind of precision that could only belong to something purposeful, something with intent. I could almost hear the rustling, the sound of footsteps, though the air was eerily still. It was like a presence just beyond my vision, always shifting, always stalking. I sped up, my eyes flicking back and forth between the road and the trees, but no matter how fast I went, the movement kept pace with me, staying just out of my reach, always just a few steps ahead. The trees felt too close now, the shadows pressing in like they were alive, the branches seeming to reach for me, as if the whole forest was part of the chase. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I realized the figure was no longer just following the trees, it was moving between them, darting across the path with terrifying speed, as though it knew exactly where I was going. I caught another glimpse of it, something dark and tall, too long, too stretched to be natural. The way it moved, with sharp, jerking motions, made my skin crawl. No, no, no! I forced myself to keep driving, my eyes flicking rapidly to the rearview mirror, my pulse racing. It was as if it could read my mind. Every time I looked back, it was there, behind the trees, just a fraction of a second too late to catch in full view. But it was there. It was real. I could feel the sweat trickling down my neck, my fingers frozen on the wheel. My heart beat harder with each passing second. The figure was gaining on me. No, it wasn't just gaining, it was already ahead, moving faster than I could comprehend. The trees were closing in on both sides of the road now, narrowing the path ahead, like the world itself was squeezing me tighter. The movement was getting closer, no longer just along the edge of the tree line, but in it, darting just beyond the reach of the headlights. A breath caught in my throat as I realized it wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't my mind playing tricks. There was something out there, something wrong. The sudden, sharp snap of a branch breaking echoed through the quiet air. I slammed on the brakes instinctively, my heart jumping into my throat. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was close, too close. My eyes flew to the side of the road, my gaze wild and frantic, searching for any sign of movement. The trees were empty now. The figure had disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. But I could still feel it, its presence lingering in the air, heavy and suffocating. I had to get out of here. Fast. I barely dared to breathe as I sat frozen in the car, my hands still gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. My heart hammered against my ribs, and the silence was deafening. But it was the absence of sound that was worst. No rustling leaves, no wind, no animals. Just an oppressive quiet that suffocated the very air around me. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. Maybe I had just been too panicked, too desperate to find an explanation for everything that had been happening. Maybe it was just the dark playing tricks on my mind. But then, the unmistakable shape appeared. A figure, tall, too tall, loomed in the middle of the road ahead of me. It wasn't the trees anymore. The movement I had glimpsed in the shadows was now right in front of me. My breath caught in my throat, and a cold sweat broke out along my spine. At first, it seemed like a man. Or, at least, it looked like one from a distance. A tall, thin figure, walking down the middle of the road with unnerving calm. But as I focused on it, I realized it wasn't just a person. It couldn't be. Its legs were impossibly long, stretching out in jerking steps, moving with an unnatural gait. Each stride seemed too far, too long. The body was gaunt, the arms hanging at angles, not swaying naturally like a human's. There was no sound, nothing but the faintest scrape of its feet dragging along the gravel road. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, and I couldn't look away. The figure moved closer, its form slowly becoming clearer in the headlights. The long limbs bent in strange angles, as though its joints didn't function the way they should, twisting unnaturally with each step. The head was low, tilted at an odd angle as though it were trying to peer into the car. The face, it was barely visible, but the outline of its features was grotesque, sharply angled, gaunt, and hollow-eyed, like a mask stretched too tightly across a skeleton's face. I couldn't breathe. Every instinct in me screamed to turn around, to drive away, but I was paralyzed. This thing, this creature, was in the middle of the road, blocking my only way out. There was no place to go, no way to escape. And then I heard it. A soft sound, almost like a whisper, but not quite. It was a dry rasp, like something dragging across the ground. The creature's head twitched up, its hollow eyes locking onto mine, and for the briefest moment, I thought I could hear its breath, slow, shallow, like it was trying to decide whether or not to approach. I blinked, desperately trying to convince myself it wasn't real, that this was just some horrifying figment of my imagination. But as the thing took another step forward, I could see the way its limbs stretched out too far, the way it dragged its foot across the road like it was stalking its prey. It wasn't a hallucination. It was real. The car's engine hummed beneath me, the sound too loud in the silence. I shifted in my seat, my eyes locked on the figure as it drew closer. My mind screamed at me to move, to drive, to do something, but my body was frozen in terror. The figure came closer, its steps deliberate, too measured, as if it knew I was there, waiting. The shadows it cast seemed to stretch out farther than they should, distorting the road ahead, making it look endless, like there was no escape. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was dry, my throat tight with panic. It was so close now. I could see the ragged outline of its silhouette, the unnatural bend of its body, and that twisted, empty gaze fixed on me. And then it stopped, right in the middle of the road. Its head tilted slightly to the side as if examining me, as if it were trying to understand what I was. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe it just knew exactly what I was. My heart thundered in my chest, my hands trembling as they hovered over the gear shift. I knew I had to move. But where could I go? This thing was blocking the entire road. The trees on either side of me felt like a trap, the darkness closing in with each passing second. It took another step forward. I was trapped. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. And that thought, it paralyzed me. Every muscle in my body refused to move, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening, to find some explanation that made sense. But the reality of the situation was inescapable. This thing, whatever it was here with me. And it wasn't going anywhere. I couldn't breathe. The moment the figure's hollow eyes locked onto mine, a primal fear surged through me, forcing me to break the paralysis that had gripped my body. My hands fumbled to turn the key, and with a jolt, the engine roared to life, filling the silence that had enveloped the road. But as I slammed my foot onto the accelerator, it was already too late. The figure, still standing in the middle of the road, twisted its body in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Its legs, impossibly long, bent and snapped into position with a sickening crack before it lunged forward with an unnatural speed that left me gasping in disbelief. For a brief moment, I thought I had imagined it. But no! It wasn't a trick of the light, or my mind playing cruel games. The creature was running. Or, more accurately, it was rushing, with the terrifying speed of something that should not be able to move so fast. Its arms swung wide as its spindly legs carried it forward, the ground beneath it seeming to bend and warp with each stride, as though the very earth was yielding to its unnatural pace. The creature was moving too quickly for anything with such a bizarre, grotesque body. Its legs stretched unnaturally long, the joints popping and bending at angles that made my stomach churn. With each stride, it covered what seemed like miles, closing the distance between us at an alarming rate. I floored the accelerator, my heart hammering in my chest. The headlights cast frantic beams of light across the dark road, but every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, the creature was closer. I had to get away. I had to escape. But no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't outrun it. The figure seemed to glide across the road, barely touching the ground, its form blurring with each step. The faster I went, the faster it moved. The headlights flickered as if the very road beneath me was resisting, as if the world itself was trying to hold me here to prevent my escape. I checked the rearview mirror again, and this time my heart nearly stopped. The figure wasn't just moving behind me, it was chasing me. Its form, once distant, now filled the reflection, a twisted silhouette gaining on me with alarming speed. My foot slammed harder on the gas. The tires screeched as the car surged forward, the engine screaming in protest as I pushed it beyond its limits. But it didn't matter. The figure was still there, right behind me, closing in with each passing second. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like some predatory animal that was closing in on its prey. The ground beneath it seemed to bend, as though it were distorting the very space it occupied. I couldn't think. I couldn't process what was happening. I only knew one thing: I had to escape, or I would die here, alone, on this godforsaken road. The sound of its footsteps was deafening now, almost synchronized with my own frantic heartbeats. The car's headlights bounced off the trees as I swerved around the bends in the road, praying that the figure wouldn't keep pace. But with every turn, with every second I thought I might be losing it, it reappeared, its unnatural speed bringing it closer again. I was running out of road. I could see the next curve up ahead, a blind turn that led deeper into the mountains, but the thought of taking it was terrifying. I didn't know what awaited me beyond that bend. Would I be trapped? Or worse, would I encounter more of these creatures, or whatever this thing was? But I didn't have a choice. There was no choice left. With my heart in my throat, I took the turn, the car screeching against the pavement as I gripped the wheel tighter, praying to any force that might listen. And then, just as I thought I might be safe, just as the curve hid the figure from my view, it reappeared, crashing through the trees at an impossible speed, its limbs twisting and contorting with horrifying precision, gaining on me faster than I could ever outrun. It was only a matter of time. My hands were shaking violently as I gripped the wheel, the tires screeching against the slick, uneven road. The speedometer climbed higher and higher, but no matter how hard I pushed the gas pedal, the figure was still there, right behind me, right on my tail. It moved with a speed that defied logic, each stride longer, more exaggerated, stretching its limbs impossibly far with a sickening, bone-cracking sound. It wasn't just running anymore, it was chasing me, tracking my every turn, every desperate swerve. The road was a blur as I tore through the darkness, the headlights casting eerie, distorted shadows on the trees that flashed by too quickly to recognize. I could see the figure in my rearview mirror, its gaunt form growing larger with every second. Its twisted, impossibly long legs moved with terrifying speed, its body almost floating above the ground, as though it was being carried by some unseen force. It didn't need to move with the normal laws of physics, its speed and distance were otherworldly. The car jolted violently as I veered off the road momentarily, narrowly avoiding a large rock that threatened to send me careening into the abyss below. My stomach lurched as the ground tilted beneath me, but I didn't dare slow down. I had no choice but to push forward. Faster. Go faster. The world outside the car was a blur of shadows and twisting trees, their skeletal branches clawing at the windows as I sped past them. The road seemed endless, stretching out in front of me, but it was also closing in, narrowing with every turn I made, the landscape becoming more twisted and unnatural with each second. In the rearview mirror, the figure had drawn even closer. I could make out the jagged outline of its limbs, the grotesque angles of its arms and legs, the way its body contorted unnaturally with each movement. Its eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, seemed to pierce through the glass, locking onto me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just chasing me now. It was hunting me. I slammed my foot harder onto the accelerator, the engine roaring in protest as I pushed the car beyond its limits. The car fishtailed slightly, its tires losing traction as I navigated another tight bend, but I didn't dare slow down. I didn't care if the car broke apart. I couldn't let it catch me. The headlights flickered erratically, casting fleeting shadows on the trees and rocks around me. The static of the radio seemed to intensify, filling the car with a low, buzzing hum that rattled my teeth. The world felt like it was closing in on me, suffocating me with the oppressive darkness. The trees seemed to reach out, their twisted branches like fingers trying to drag me off the road. I was losing control. The figure was still behind me, gaining ground with every turn, every reckless maneuver. My heart was pounding in my chest, the sound of it deafening in my ears. I couldn't think straight anymore. I could only focus on one thing, escaping. I looked up ahead. There was another curve, another bend in the road, but this one was sharper. Too sharp. If I didn't slow down, I'd crash. And then it would be over. But I couldn't. I couldn't afford to stop. Not even for a second. With one last desperate scream of the engine, I threw the car into the turn. The tires screamed in protest, skidding across the asphalt as I desperately tried to stay on the road. My body lurched sideways, my stomach tightening in terror, but somehow the car stayed on track. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, my blood ran cold. The figure had passed the turn, its grotesque limbs swinging in perfect synchrony, bending and stretching at impossible angles to match the sharp curve. It didn't even hesitate. It was still following me. The panic in my chest surged to a new height. There was no way to outrun it, not on this road, not in this cursed place. The mountains were swallowing me whole, the darkness closing in, the creature gaining on me like it had all the time in the world. The road ahead became a blur, and I had no idea where I was going anymore, only that I had to keep going. Keep moving. Keep running. But for how much longer could I keep this up? With every turn, with every desperate swerve, I knew the end was getting closer. And with it, the creature that had been stalking me through the night. I couldn't keep running. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. If I didn't do something soon, I wouldn't make it out of these mountains alive. The fear was suffocating, pressing down on my chest, but it was no longer just about survival. It was about control, about taking charge of the situation before the situation took control of me. The figure was still behind me, growing closer with every passing moment, its legs stretching unnaturally long, its form twisting and contorting like some nightmare made real. No matter how fast I drove, it kept up with me, as if it were mocking my desperate attempts to escape. I couldn't outrun it. A sickening thought crossed my mind as I glanced in the rearview mirror. What if there was no escape at all? What if this creature was never going to let me go? What if I was already marked, a doomed soul trapped in its pursuit? I couldn't let that happen. I had to stop it. The road ahead was just more of the same winding path, the same forest closing in, the same oppressive darkness. There was no end in sight, no safe haven, and no more time to think. The engine of my car roared beneath me, but even that wasn't enough to drown out the terrifying sound of the creature's footsteps growing louder with every second. I slammed my foot onto the brake and swerved the car off the road. The tires screamed as they hit the dirt, the car lurching violently to the side, but I held on, steering it with shaky hands into the dark woods. Branches whipped against the windows, scratching and clawing at the glass, but I didn't care. The creature was still coming, and I had to face it. I gritted my teeth and pressed on, the car bouncing over rocks and uneven ground, the engine protesting with each bump. I couldn't stop now. I needed to get close enough to confront it, to figure out what it was, why it was hunting me, and, most importantly, how to end it. For all my fear, I could feel a spark of something else rising inside me, determination. I was done being the prey. I wasn't going to be chased any longer. I turned a sharp corner, and the trees opened up to reveal a small clearing. A stretch of dirt, broken only by a few scattered boulders. This was it. This was the moment. I brought the car to a stop, the headlights illuminating the clearing. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, but I didn't hesitate. The figure was close. I could feel it. I took one last deep breath. If I'm going to die tonight, I won't die running. The air felt thick with anticipation, the shadows creeping closer. I turned off the engine, plunging the car into a quiet, suffocating stillness. The headlights were still on, but the darkness beyond them felt alive, watching, waiting. Then, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, rhythmic and deliberate, drawing nearer. I didn't turn around. I didn't dare. I could feel its presence growing closer, like a weight in the air, pressing down on me. It was time. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold night. The gravel crunched under my boots as I moved toward the edge of the clearing, keeping my eyes fixed on the darkness. I was ready. And as I stood there, waiting for the creature to emerge, I could only hope that the fear I felt in the pit of my stomach wouldn't be my undoing. I never should have done it. In a single, reckless decision, I had veered off the road, thinking I could face the thing, confront the impossible. But now, as the car bounced and lurched over the rough terrain, I realized how much I had underestimated the danger. The sound of the engine roaring was drowned out by the wild rattle of the suspension as I swerved, narrowly missing rocks and tree trunks that seemed to spring up from nowhere. The headlights illuminated only a small patch of chaos, the rest of the world cloaked in darkness. I tried to regain control of the car, my hands tightening around the wheel, but the ground beneath me was unstable, wet, uneven, and full of hidden dips. The tires lost traction, slipping and sliding, as if the road itself didn't want me here. The car jolted violently, the metal groaning in protest as I fought to steady it. The panic was suffocating now. My breath came in short, frantic gasps as I saw the shadow in my side mirror again, the figure, growing closer, moving impossibly fast. No, no, no! I jerked the wheel too hard, trying to dodge a boulder that had appeared out of nowhere. The tires screeched as they hit the loose gravel, and the car spun, once, twice, before slamming into a thick tree trunk. The world turned upside down. Everything was a blur of broken glass and crumpling metal as the car finally came to a halt. My head slammed against the side window, and I felt the sting of blood on my temple, but I didn't care. My ears were ringing, my vision blurred, but there was only one thing that mattered. The creature was still out there. I blinked through the haze of confusion and panic, my body aching as I slowly pushed myself upright. The car had come to rest at an awkward angle, half on its side, the engine sputtering to a stop. The headlights were still on, casting long, wavering shadows across the trees. I could hear the distant sound of footsteps again, closer this time. The figure was almost here. I had to get out. I had to move. The door on my side was wedged shut, but I managed to push it open enough to crawl out into the cold night air. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I stumbled away from the wrecked car, my body unsteady and disoriented. I looked back at the car, its engine still smoking, the once bright headlights now flickering in and out of existence. The forest around me seemed to close in, the trees towering like dark sentinels. I was completely alone now, stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no way to get out. And yet, I could feel the presence of the creature even before I saw it. It was getting closer, moving with that same terrifying speed, the air growing heavier with every passing second. The once silent woods now echoed with the thud of its feet hitting the ground. I couldn't escape on foot, not with the night closing in, not with the creature on my trail. But the car was useless now. I had no other choice. I turned away from the wreckage, my heart pounding in my chest as I moved deeper into the forest. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer, more deliberate. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't done with me. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what I was running toward. But I knew one thing for sure, the nightmare was just beginning. I had barely taken a few steps when I felt it, the change in the air. A thick, suffocating presence settled around me, colder than the night should have been. The hairs on my neck stood up, my heartbeat echoing in my ears, drowning out the sounds of the forest. I knew it was close. Too close. I couldn't bring myself to turn around, but I felt its gaze, the weight of its eyes pressing into my back like burning coals. The figure. The creature. Whatever it was right there. I forced myself to breathe, each inhale shaky, uneven. Just keep moving, I told myself, but the words felt hollow. My legs were trembling beneath me, and every step I took felt like it could be my last. The trees seemed to close in on me, their dark silhouettes twisting like they, too, were afraid of what was following. And then, without warning, I heard it, a sound that froze my blood. A heavy, deliberate footstep. A thud that seemed to shake the very earth beneath me. It was too close now. I dared to glance over my shoulder. For a split second, I saw it standing just beyond the reach of the car's flickering headlights. The outline was tall, impossibly tall. Its body was too thin, its limbs stretched and elongated in a way that no human body should move. But what made my stomach churn wasn't its size, or the speed with which it moved. It was the way it moved. It was wrong. It didn't walk like anything natural. Its legs were long, twisted, bending unnaturally as it advanced. Each step seemed to stretch the distance between us, the limbs folding and unfolding in grotesque angles. The figure was gaunt, so gaunt that its skin seemed to stretch over its bones like old leather. And though the dim light from the car illuminated it just enough for me to see its shape, its features remained obscured, hidden in the shadows. But even in the dark, even through the veil of night, I could feel its presence. It was watching me. I stumbled back, tripping over a root, falling hard onto the cold, uneven ground. The world spun for a moment as I scrambled to push myself up, but before I could even stand, I heard it again, another footstep, closer this time. It was here. I could feel its breath now, not physical but somehow tangible, like the air itself was being suffocated by its presence. I strained my eyes, trying to catch a glimpse of its face, anything that would make sense of what I was seeing. But all I could make out was the outline of its head, its long arms hanging at odd angles, and something else, something that made my stomach flip over. Its mouth. It wasn't visible, not fully, but I could feel it, an impression of something unnaturally wide, its edges stretching too far, too impossibly wide for any human being. My mind refused to process it. My brain couldn't make sense of the horror unfolding before me. I could hear it now, the sound of its limbs dragging across the ground, scraping and scratching, like some kind of horrific insect. It was moving toward me, and I was paralyzed. I couldn't look away, couldn't move, couldn't scream. The creature was almost upon me, and everything in my body screamed for me to run, to do something, but I was frozen, locked in place by terror. The air was thick with its presence, choking me. And then it stopped. I held my breath, my heart thundering in my chest. I dared not move, dared not even breathe. The figure stood there, silent, still, watching me. Its presence was overwhelming, a weight that seemed to crush me from all sides. And then it tilted its head. It was as if it had been waiting for me to notice it. A slight, almost imperceptible movement, but it felt like the world had just tilted on its axis. The creature was not only aware of me, it was studying me. I felt its gaze penetrate through me, as though it could see every part of my soul, every ounce of fear, every ounce of weakness. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. It wasn't just hunting me, it was playing with me. I couldn't breathe. The air was too thick, too dense with dread. But I knew I couldn't stay here forever. And I couldn't outrun it anymore. The chase was over. Now, it was my turn to face whatever nightmare this thing had come to deliver. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every muscle in my body was locked, frozen in place by sheer terror. The figure's eyes, or at least, I assumed they were eyes, were locked onto me, piercing through the darkness. I felt the weight of its gaze like an iron shackle, pulling me deeper into the pit of dread. But I couldn't just stand here. I had to do something. My eyes darted around, searching for any means of escape, any way to hide. The forest stretched endlessly around me, the trees thick and dense, but there was nowhere to run that wouldn't bring me face to face with the creature. I couldn't outrun it, and it was clear by now that it wasn't in a hurry to catch me. It was playing with me, enjoying the terror it was slowly building inside of me. I quickly looked back at the red car. It was still a few yards away, but I could already feel the engine's cold, dead weight in the air. It was useless now. The doors were jammed, and I could already see that the tires had been crushed in the spin. There would be no driving away. No way to escape. My hands trembled as I quickly scanned the ground. I needed something. A weapon. A rock, a branch, anything that could make a difference. My mind raced, but nothing was clear. Nothing seemed like it could stop this thing, this horror. In the distance, I heard the unmistakable sound of its footsteps again. Heavy, deliberate. It was closing in. My heart skipped a beat. It was almost time. It was almost too late. I turned and sprinted toward the edge of the clearing, hoping against hope that there was something, anything, that could offer me a chance. The trees ahead of me were dense, but there had to be something that could give me cover. I moved fast, my mind a whirl of panic, my body too slow to keep up with the mounting terror. I reached a thick trunk and ducked behind it, praying that the creature wouldn't see me. My breathing was loud in my ears, ragged and frantic. I pressed my back against the rough bark, trying to steady myself, but my head was spinning. How long had I been running? How much time did I have? The forest around me was eerily silent, save for the faint sound of the creature's feet dragging over the ground. It was getting closer. It was still searching for me, still moving deliberately, like it knew exactly where I was but was just toying with me. I couldn't hide forever. My eyes desperately scanned the ground once more, but all I could see were the same trees, the same rocks, the same hopeless landscape. Then, I saw it. A large rock, jagged and heavy, half buried in the dirt near the base of a tree. It was the only thing that looked remotely useful. I reached for it, my fingers scraping against the rough surface as I pulled it free from the ground. It wasn't much, but it was something. I gripped it tightly, my knuckles white, and looked around again. There has to be a way to stop this. I couldn't just wait for it to find me. I needed a plan, something that would give me a chance. I took a deep breath and forced myself to steady my shaking hands. I couldn't afford to make a mistake. I was crouching low, trying to keep myself hidden behind the tree. The rock was heavy in my hand, its weight offering some small comfort. As the footsteps grew closer, I knew I had only one chance. I would have to fight back. The creature was so close now that I could hear its breath, heavy, strained, as if it was feeding off the fear in the air. The ground seemed to shake with its every step. I pushed myself into position, my heart hammering in my chest. My grip tightened around the rock. If I was going to survive this night, I had to make it count. Then, I heard it. The faintest crack of a twig. It was right on top of me now. I could see its shadow moving in the corner of my eye, its twisted limbs stretching unnaturally far. It's now or never. I swung the rock with all my strength, aiming for whatever part of the creature I could reach. The sound of the rock connecting with something hard echoed in the stillness. But the instant the impact landed, something worse happened. The creature didn't even flinch. It didn't stop. It didn't react. It was worse than I had feared. The rock had done nothing. It was useless. The creature's form shifted, its long limbs moving even faster, its twisted body bending impossibly in ways that shouldn't be possible. It let out a guttural, inhuman sound, a laugh, or something like it, and took one more deliberate step forward. I was out of time. The creature was almost upon me, and I knew there would be no fighting it. There would be no running. The air around me was thick, suffocating, as if the night itself had become a living, breathing entity pressing in from every side. I could feel the creature's presence now more than ever, its energy surrounding me, suffusing the very air with a malevolent weight. I stood frozen behind the tree, my heart racing, barely able to comprehend the horror that was unfolding. I had swung the rock, tried to fight back, but the creature hadn't flinched. It hadn't even acknowledged my desperate strike. The faint echo of the rock hitting something hard was still ringing in my ears, but now the only sound was the rhythmic, heavy thud of its steps. It was so close. I didn't dare look. I couldn't. But I could feel its gaze, like 1,000 eyes boring into me, knowing exactly where I was. I could feel it circling me in the darkness, toying with me like a predator with its prey. Then it stopped. A sudden, unnatural stillness descended on the scene, and I thought, for a moment, that my heart had stopped entirely. The air became heavier. The sound of the creature's footsteps faded. Its breathing, its presence, everything fell silent. I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was it waiting for me to move? Was it savoring the fear, letting it build before it struck? Or had it simply grown bored of this game? I couldn't tell. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. No sounds, no movement. Just the thick silence that had wrapped itself around me. I dared not breathe too loudly, afraid that even the smallest noise would trigger its attack. And then, it tilted its head. A slow, deliberate motion, as if considering me, weighing the situation, as if this whole ordeal was some twisted amusement. Its form shifted in the darkness, just out of the corner of my vision, its limbs moving with an eerie grace. The way it moved, unnatural, otherworldly, seemed to mock the very essence of life. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw it smile. The idea sent a fresh wave of terror through me, my body locking up as I fought to keep from screaming. Its smile was wide, impossibly wide, like a stretch of dark sky with no end. But no, I hadn't seen it. It was my mind playing tricks on me, trying to hold on to some semblance of rationality. But it was there, right in front of me. The creature was waiting. I could feel its presence growing, stretching, wrapping itself tighter around me. It knew I was here. It knew I was terrified. And then, without any warning, I heard its voice. It wasn't a voice, really, not in the way I'd expect from any living thing. It was more like a hiss, a scraping sound that seemed to come from deep within the ground itself. A low, terrible whisper that crawled under my skin. Run, it seemed to say. Or maybe it was more of a thought, something implanted into my brain. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that it didn't mean for me to get away. It was telling me to run because it wanted me to. It was playing with me. My breath hitched, my heart thumping painfully in my chest. I could feel the creature moving closer, and I knew there was nothing left I could do to escape. The fear, thick as fog, clouded my mind, drowning out any rational thought. I was at its mercy, and it had none. For a brief moment, time itself seemed to bend. The creature paused, as if savoring the moment, letting me feel the full weight of my fear. The shadow loomed over me, twisting and elongating, until I was sure it was not just watching me, it was waiting for me to break. And in that silence, in that oppressive stillness, I made a choice. I couldn't fight. I couldn't outrun it. But I could do one thing. I could scream. A primal sound ripped from my throat, the last shred of my sanity fighting back. I screamed, not for help, not for mercy, but to release the overwhelming terror that was clawing at my mind. It was all I had left. And then, in the next instant, the creature moved. It wasn't a rush, not a frantic lunge, but a slow, deliberate motion that sent a chill down my spine. Every movement was calculated, and I realized it wasn't just hunting me. It was savoring my fear. The last thing I saw, before everything went black, was the smile. The smile of something that wasn't alive, something that wasn't human. It stretched wider, impossibly wide, and I knew then there was no escape. I don't know how long I was out. It felt like an eternity, a void where time had no meaning. One moment, the creature was there, so close that I could feel its chilling presence pressing against my skin, and then the next, everything went silent. Still, as though the world had been holding its breath. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog from my mind. I was on the ground. No, not the ground. I was slumped against the car, my back pressed into the metal of the wrecked vehicle. The dark, oppressive forest surrounded me, the trees looming like silent witnesses to whatever had just happened. The panic rushed back in waves, and I gasped for air, my body trembling. My hands were covered in dirt, my skin clammy with cold sweat. I couldn't stop shaking. The creature, what had it done to me? What was it? Where had it gone? I looked around frantically. The air felt thick, the silence almost unbearable. There was no sound of movement, no footsteps dragging along the road. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for me to do the same. I couldn't stay here. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky and weak beneath me. My mind was a blur, but I had only one thought: I had to get out. I staggered toward the car, my hands fumbling for the door handle, too disoriented to think clearly. I could still feel its presence, like a shadow that clung to the edges of my vision. The weight of its gaze, its twisted form lingering in my mind. But it was gone. I didn't hear its footsteps anymore. I didn't feel the earth tremble beneath its unnatural steps. With trembling hands, I managed to open the door. The interior of the car smelled like gasoline and burnt rubber. The dashboard was cracked, and the air was thick with the stench of smoke. But I didn't care about any of that. I threw myself into the driver's seat, hands still shaking as I grabbed the wheel. My breath came in short, ragged bursts, but I forced myself to focus. I couldn't think about what had happened. I couldn't think about the creature that had hunted me. I couldn't think about the fear that still clung to every nerve in my body. I had to move. I had to get away. I turned the ignition key, and the engine sputtered to life. A sound that felt like the first real breath I'd taken since the nightmare had begun. I pressed my foot to the gas, feeling the tires scrape against the gravel as the car lurched forward. The road ahead stretched out into the darkness, the trees lining either side like silent, watching figures. I could see the faint outline of the road curving into the distance, the path that would lead me out of this godforsaken place. I looked into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that towering figure behind me. But the mirror was empty. There was nothing but the blackness of the mountain pass, and the harsh light of my headlights cutting through the darkness like a beacon. But even though I couldn't see it, I felt it. I could feel it lurking in the shadows, always just out of sight, watching, waiting for the moment when it would strike again. I pressed the gas harder, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The engine roared beneath me, the car picking up speed as I tore down the road, desperate to escape. But every part of me knew it was useless. There was no escape from it. The creature wasn't something that could be outrun. As I reached the next curve in the road, I saw something that made my heart stop. At the edge of the clearing, standing under the trees, was the figure. Its long, twisted body silhouetted against the faint light of the moon. It was waiting. I slammed my foot onto the brake, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The car jerked forward, the momentum pushing me against the seat. My chest tightened, my vision blurring with panic as I tried to steer, to control the car. But I couldn't. The figure didn't move. It didn't flinch. It didn't even acknowledge the car speeding toward it. It just stood there, its form tall and impossibly thin, the faintest glint of something in its eyes. Something cold. Something that told me there would be no more running. I swerved. The car spun out of control, tires screeching against the road, the world tilting at an impossible angle. My body was thrown against the door as the vehicle careened off the road, heading straight for the trees. I tried to steer, to regain control, but it was too late. The car crashed into the forest, the sound of metal tearing through wood and branches filling the air. My body was thrown forward, my head slamming into the steering wheel. Everything went black. And in that darkness, the last thing I heard was the sound of its breath. Slow. Deliberate. Like a predator closing in for the kill. I woke with a jolt. My head throbbed painfully, my vision swimming, but I could still hear the sound, the unmistakable crunch of twigs and the snap of branches, drawing closer, too close. The car was tilted at an awkward angle, half crashed against the trees, the headlights now useless, casting long, twisted shadows into the night. My heart raced, and I could feel the blood pounding in my temples as I fought to regain control of my senses. I could barely breathe. Each inhalation felt like I was suffocating, drowning in the weight of the night. But then, I heard it again. The footsteps. The slow, deliberate crunch, followed by the sound of something dragging through the underbrush. I could feel the vibrations in the ground, each step shaking the earth beneath me, as if the creature was coming for me with a purpose, with hunger. I didn't have time to think. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave. My hands gripped the steering wheel, but I was disoriented. My body felt heavy, weighed down by the fear that had taken root in my chest. My legs refused to move, my mind too clouded to make any rational decisions. And then it appeared. In the broken beam of the car's headlights, I saw it. That towering figure, moving unnaturally fast, emerging from the edge of the woods like a living nightmare. Its elongated limbs reached out with unnatural grace, its pale skin nearly glowing in the dim light, and its head tilted unnervingly to the side as it advanced. Its eyes, those eyes, were fixed on me, and they burned with a malice that sent a cold shiver straight through my spine. It was as if it knew everything about me, every fear, every weakness. It knew exactly how to torment me. I scrambled to unbuckle my seatbelt, my hands shaking violently, too slow, too panicked. But I had no choice. I had to get out of the car. I had to run. The door was jammed. I yanked at the handle with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. The creature was closer now, so close that I could hear the slow, rasping sound of its breath, filling the night air with an unsettling rhythm. Each breath it took sounded wrong, like it was breathing through something far darker, far more unnatural than a human ever could. And then, it was at the car. The ground trembled with each step it took, and I could feel the very air shift as it closed the distance. My eyes locked onto the twisted, long legs that carried it toward me, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw it smile. That same, impossibly wide grin that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of its face. The creature was toying with me, playing with its prey, and I knew, deep in my gut, that I was nothing more than a game to it. I could feel its shadow creeping over me, growing longer, taller, suffocating the last remnants of hope I had left. I was trapped. But then, a surge of adrenaline shot through me, overriding the fear, overriding everything else. I wasn't going to die like this. I couldn't. I twisted my body, finally getting the door open with one desperate, last-ditch effort. The cool night air hit my face like a slap, but I didn't hesitate. I pushed myself out of the car, stumbling onto the uneven ground. My legs barely held me up, but I ran. I ran as fast as I could. I heard it behind me, the creature's heavy, deliberate steps, closer now than ever. It wasn't running. It didn't need to run. It was chasing me, each step calculating, sure. The pace it kept was terrifying, like a predator tracking its prey. It was playing the long game now, savoring the terror that radiated off me. I looked over my shoulder, and in the briefest of moments, I saw its face. It was too much. I screamed. A scream that came from the very depths of my soul, as if I were crying out to the heavens for mercy. But I knew, deep down, there would be no mercy. The creature didn't slow. In fact, it quickened. The long, thin legs seemed to stretch and lengthen, each step bringing it closer, its body moving faster than anything should. Its face, that twisted mask of emptiness, was now inches away, filling my vision with its grotesque features, its unblinking stare. I couldn't outrun it. I was too slow, too weak. But then, suddenly, a light. A distant glow pierced the darkness, a set of headlights coming around the bend of the mountain pass. A car. Please, I thought, please, let them see me. I stumbled toward the road, desperate to reach the light, to reach safety. I didn't look back, couldn't. I just ran, with everything I had left, each step fueled by the raw, primal instinct to survive. But I was too far from the road. The creature was right behind me. I felt its presence again, just inches away, the air growing colder, the ground shaking. It was right there. And then, nothing. I froze. I couldn't hear it anymore. I couldn't feel it. I dared not look back, but my legs felt like they had been turned to stone. I was suspended in time, a moment of total stillness. But in that silence, I knew. It had won. My fingers trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, the car's engine sputtering in protest. The road stretched out before me like a ribbon of darkness, narrow and treacherous, winding through the mountains. The headlights cast eerie beams across the jagged rocks and dense trees, their twisted shapes only amplifying the growing sense of dread that had settled deep in my chest. I had no idea how long I'd been driving, how much time had passed since I'd run from the creature, from it. All I knew was that I was still trapped in this cursed pass, still trying to outrun something that refused to let me go. The car jolted again, the engine whining before it sputtered to a complete stop. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of it pressing down on me like a physical thing. I slammed my palm against the steering wheel in frustration, trying to restart the engine, but it was no use. The car was dead, stranded on this forsaken stretch of road, miles from any sign of civilization. Why now? Why here? I cursed under my breath, my panic rising as I tried to turn the key again, the engine only coughing in protest. My mind raced through every possibility. Was it the altitude? The cold? Something else? None of it mattered. I was stuck. The air outside was thick, cold, and still. I could feel it pressing in on me, suffocating. The creature was out there somewhere, and I could sense it, just beyond the edge of the headlights, waiting, watching, taking its time. It's playing with me. I dared to glance into the side mirror, hoping to see nothing, but there was something, movement. I turned my head sharply, my pulse quickening. There, in the shadows just beyond the reach of my headlights, I saw it. That towering figure, standing motionless, its silhouette barely visible against the darkness. No. No, no, no. My breath caught in my throat, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the light, but I knew that feeling. I knew that presence. It was here. It was coming. I slammed my hand down on the horn, the sound echoing through the narrow pass, desperate for anyone, for anything to hear me, to save me. But it was pointless. There was no one here. No one to help. The figure didn't move at first. It just stood there, its height impossible, its limbs too long, stretching beyond what any human could possibly achieve. It was motionless, but I could feel its eyes on me, those cold, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me, digging into the very core of my soul. Then, without warning, it began to move. Slowly at first, just a step forward. Then another. Its legs stretched unnaturally long, its steps impossibly large, closing the distance between us with terrifying ease. It wasn't running. It didn't need to. It was toying with me. I could hear it now, each step loud in the silence, the sound of its feet dragging across the gravel as it approached, each footfall reverberating through the earth beneath me. I slammed the car into gear, my hands shaking as I tried to coax the engine back to life, but it was useless. The engine sputtered once more, a final, hopeless gasp. The car was dead. I was trapped. The creature was close now, so close I could feel the ground tremble with every step it took. I tried to open the door, but it was stuck. The lock was jammed. My heart pounded in my chest as I desperately tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. I was sealed in the car, my only means of escape completely useless. This is it. I could hear its breathing now. It was a low, rasping sound, almost like a growl, a sound that reverberated through the air, vibrating my very bones. The creature was right outside, looming over me. I could almost feel its breath on my skin. And then, I saw it. The creature's face, its grin, twisted and wide, stretching impossibly far across its face. Its eyes gleamed in the headlights, glowing like twin orbs of malevolent light. It was towering over me now, bending down, its body twisting unnaturally as it leaned closer. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I was paralyzed with fear, the creature's presence suffocating every part of me. It was too much, too overwhelming. There was nowhere to go. It reached out, one of its long, elongated arms stretching toward me, the hand too large, too unnatural to be human. The window. I had to break the window. I fumbled for the handle, my fingers numb with panic, but as I touched the door, I felt it, a cold, unnatural pressure against my chest, as if something invisible was holding me down, trapping me in the car. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was right there. And then, the figure's hand pressed against the glass. Its fingers stretched across the surface, the nails impossibly long, dragging across the window like claws against glass. It didn't stop. The sound was agonizing, each scrape like a death sentence. I knew what was coming. I knew what it wanted. And then, the glass shattered. The glass shattered with a deafening crack, the shards exploding into the car's interior, biting into my skin. I recoiled instinctively, but there was no escaping the cold, unnatural grip that the creature had on me. I tried to move, to breathe, but every muscle in my body refused to obey. My heart raced as I watched the monstrous hand curl around the shattered window, its long, spindly fingers reaching into the car. My entire body went numb with terror. I was paralyzed, the sight of its grotesque hand inching closer to me burning into my mind. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only stare, wide-eyed and helpless, as it slowly dragged its fingers along the frame of the car, its grip tightening. The sound of its breath, low, ragged, like the wind through a desolate forest, filled the car, growing louder, nearer. I could feel the weight of its presence, pressing down on me, suffocating me. Its breath was thick with hunger, a primal need that sent chills crawling up my spine. It leaned in, the towering figure blocking out the headlights completely. The last thing I saw was its face, stretched wide into a grotesque grin that sent waves of icy dread through every fiber of my being. Then, it was all too much. The darkness closed in on me. The overwhelming presence of the creature, the suffocating terror, the deafening silence that followed the shattering of the glass, it was all too much to bear. My vision blurred, the world around me spinning as if everything was slipping away. I screamed. A single, gut-wrenching scream that tore from the depths of my soul, a scream filled with the terror of impending death, the agony of helplessness. It echoed through the mountains, bouncing off the cliffs and rocks, reverberating in the hollow emptiness of the pass. The scream carried through the air, as if it were reaching out to the vast, unseen wilderness. But there was no answer. The scream didn't stop. It echoed endlessly, as if the mountains themselves were carrying it, amplifying it, stretching it far beyond the reach of time and space. And as the sound of my own terror reverberated through the darkness, the world around me went dark. The headlights blinked once, twice, and then nothing. All that remained was the silence. The eerie, oppressive silence of the night. The mountains, once alive with the rush of the wind and the rustling of the trees, were now mute. And in the distance, far beyond the veil of night, the faintest trace of a figure could be seen standing at the edge of the road, watching. But the scream had ended. Days passed. The New Hampshire mountains, once so serene and isolated, had become the backdrop to a mystery that no one could explain. The pass, with its winding roads and jagged cliffs, was quiet again. Too quiet. On the third day after the disappearance, a group of hikers ventured along the same road. They were used to the isolation, the eerie stillness that seemed to hang over the pass, but even they could feel something was different this time. The air felt heavier, the world around them just a little too still, as if waiting. As they approached the bend, one of them spotted it, the car. At first, they thought it was an abandoned vehicle, perhaps someone who had gotten stuck or lost. But as they drew closer, the sight of the car sent an uncomfortable shiver down their spines. The door was wide open. The windows were shattered, as though something or someone had violently torn its way out. But there was no sign of struggle. No blood. No signs of life. The engine was cold, long since dead, but the interior was still littered with the remnants of the night, broken glass, the faint smell of something metallic, a few scattered personal items. But no driver. No sign of the person who had been in the car just days before. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The hikers took a few steps closer, cautiously scanning the area. And that's when they noticed the footprints. They were large, unnaturally large, and they circled the car. They didn't just appear near the vehicle. No, these tracks stretched out, deep and imprinted into the earth, as if something heavy had walked around the car in slow, deliberate steps. They weren't the marks of a human, nor any animal they could identify. The prints were elongated, the toes stretching impossibly long with a peculiar, unearthly curve. They couldn't make sense of it. The footprints didn't just follow a simple path. They were scattered in strange patterns, as though the creature, or whatever had made them, had been circling the car for hours. But no sign of the driver. No blood. No evidence of a struggle. Only the deep, eerie footprints. The hikers felt the air grow colder. One of them turned to leave, but the others stayed, rooted to the spot, staring at the marks that seemed to lead away from the car, disappearing into the dense forest. Something in the back of their minds told them they weren't alone. But before they could leave, one of the hikers swore he saw something, a figure, just at the edge of the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its long limbs stretched unnaturally against the backdrop of the mountains. They couldn't make out the details, just the silhouette, towering, watching. And then it was gone, swallowed by the shadows. A chill ran down their spines. They turned and ran, not looking back, not daring to question what they had seen. Back at the ranger station, the report was filed. The car was impounded, and search parties were dispatched. But no one found any trace of the missing driver. Not even a shred of clothing. The authorities chalked it up to a tragic disappearance, perhaps a wild animal, perhaps something else. But deep in the woods, the legend of the past lived on, and the footprints remained. And the creature, whatever it was still out there. Still waiting. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.